Hello to everybody joining. Thank you for being here today. We are going to give it just a few minutes to let all of our participants join the room, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Hello and welcome. My name is Sydney Wycliffe, and I'm the events coordinator for the KC Chamber. I have a few housekeeping items before we get started today. Your mics were muted as you entered the meeting today. Additionally, during today's webinar, feel free to use the chat feature or the Q&A feature, both at the bottom and your toolbar, to submit your questions and comments. And then the last little bit of housekeeping that I have for us today is interactive, but it's super simple. So today's webinar will include closed captioning. So you are viewing one of our presenter screens at the moment. And to ensure you can see both the presenters and the slide with captions, go ahead and join me in taking your cursor to the top of your screen. There should be a green bar that says you're viewing Darla Wilkerson's screen. And next to that, there's a drop-down menu. So go ahead and click into that menu and select the side-by-side mode. You should see the screen as well as, I guess, me, because I'm the one talking at the moment. But that should get us all set and ready to go. So I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to the KC Chamber Director of Diversity and Inclusion, Greg Valdivino, and he'll kick us off today.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us this morning. As Sydney said, my name is Greg Valdivino. I'm the Director of Diversity and Inclusion here at the Greater Kansas City Chamber of Commerce. And this morning, we will be covering the topic of taking action during the COVID-19 crisis to hire and retain people with disabilities. This is part 3 of the KC Chamber's Diversity and Inclusion Workshop series. Now, before I get started by introducing our speakers this morning, I'd like to kick us off by filling out or participating in a quick live poll. So, Sydney, if you can put up the poll, please. You should see in front of you 2 questions, and we'll start the polling as soon as you see those questions. There you go already. So we're allowed for about 10 more seconds. All right, well, thank you. That was fast and easy. Thank you so much, Sydney. Let's go ahead and share the results. But before I share the results, I'm going to introduce our speakers this morning. Our first speaker is Darla Wilkerson. She's the Executive Director at Disability Inclusion of Greater Kansas City. And Mr. Andy Traub, Vice President of Human Resources and Allied Inclusion Works at Allied Global Services. Welcome.
Thank you.
So before we get started with the questions, let's look at the results of the poll and give us your feedback or your thoughts on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I found it interesting when we asked the question about the celebration of the 30th anniversary of the ADA that a good number of people, about 53%, it looks like, don't know if they have any activities planned, and another good number of people are saying that they don't have anything planned. So we'll talk a little bit about that, I think, as we get into the conversation. But I think it's a good place to start, especially when we look at the next question and we ask people if they include disability inclusion in their diversity and inclusion statements. So if that's a piece of the overall diversity and inclusion strategies, then this is a great time to celebrate part of inclusion for people with disabilities.
Yeah, I would actually agree. The fact that, we're looking at something that talks about 30 years ago, the ADA being signed, and we're going to talk a lot more about that, but to today, it wasn't very long ago to where disability and inclusion wasn't even mentioned. It wasn't even a thought. And now it's actually being brought to the forefront in inclusion statements and mission statements, and not just an EEOC or EEO statement. It's like it's becoming more part of it. So to see that, it's actually a dichotomy of where we were to where we are now, and it's actually kind of nice, refreshing for Darla and I, who've been in this space for a long time, to actually say, hey, it's moving, the dial's moving a little bit. So yeah, I certainly enjoy it. And then the other part about it is that, the part that if you don't know, this is a great time to ask. You never know, your question may spark either something about the ADA, or if you don't know about the mission statement or inclusion statement, ask. And just asking may be enough to spark some interest within your company.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Sydney. We can stop sharing the results. So let's stay on that topic of the ADA. So this year's the 30th anniversary that was signed by President Bush in 1990. So what caused the ADA to be signed by President Bush?
I wish there was one blanket statement you could give. There were many activities that led up to that signing, and I think the classic photo that people might remember is that the actual signing of the document in 1990 with President George H.W. Bush, there in the gardens, and having a couple of other people that were pretty prominent in the passing of the ADA with him. but many advocates, years back in the 70s, a lot of people were doing a lot of protesting and peaceful protesting and really looking at what do we need to do in terms of our civil rights as people with disabilities. And that's a huge piece of legislation that is a civil rights movement, just to prohibit the discrimination of people with disabilities in public life. Up to that point, employers were able to discriminate against someone with a disability for hiring, and that piece of legislation has really proven to be protective of people's civil rights. And really, it was a unified voice of people with disabilities, really, looking at how do we make sure that disability is a part of those statements when it comes to discrimination against, race, color, sex, religion, all of those other areas that are protected. Up to 1990, people with disabilities were not. So it's very important to recognize that. I think the couple of the senators that you guys might know about, Senator Bob Dole was very active in supporting that. He was also a person with a disability. And Senator Harkin from Iowa was a huge advocate, as well as Ted Kennedy. Two of the strong senators from the Midwest were really pushing that, Senator Harkin and Bob Dole. So I think that that's important to really understand the history of how it actually got passed.
I think the other part about that is if you look at 30 years ago, individuals' disabilities, quite frankly, depending on the level of disability they might have or severity of their condition, families were actually sending them off to different places to live for the rest of the duration of their life. There's state hospitals that were set up all around the United States to where people were being sent. If you had a disabling condition and not necessarily able to care for yourself or whatever, people were sent out, sent away. The other part about that is that oftentimes, people today will ask us, well, what's the big deal about the ADA? Why was it even passed? Because we're looking at it from a lens from today. The reality is employers are doing horrible things. I mean, there are things that were being done that there was no protections whatsoever. So it wasn't only just, life in the, for an individual with disability, giving them an opportunity to have that second chance in life to be able to understand and be involved in employment, meaningful employment. At that point in time, we talked about, in the 90s, it's the same pay, same job, same expectations. Before it was the same job, much lower pay, and expectations, they were kind of, here or there. So I think it really was a part that legislation was game changing for so many employers and individuals with disabilities, just to give them that voice that they've been needing.
Yeah, absolutely. And it also many other areas when I first mentioned that it has to do with public life, oftentimes people don't realize there's several titles to the ADA, and each of them are very specific as to what their protection is covering. And so we've got access to facilities, access to buildings, and many of us probably see that today, those different ways that people are accessing, getting into the front door. For example, we see ramps, we see automatic doors, those kinds of things, accessible restrooms, accessible parking. It's huge. Many people sometimes might get frustrated that there's 30 accessible parking spaces in the front of a building, but those are crucial for people who can't walk long distances or so forth. The other piece too is that we recognize the transportation component of the ADA. So anything that has to do with public transportation prior to that was not even thought of, for someone to be able to take a city bus or a cab or any kind of other type of transportation. And then we know that The amendment in 2008 really helped propel the technology and communication piece of the ADA. So we know even today, we've got one example of the captioning. Prior to that, it wasn't even thought of. So it's really been a huge game changer, like Andy said, for people with disabilities.
I think one other thing to point that out is that in the 90s, ADA was the aspiration. If you can get to the level what ADA was requiring you to be, that was moving the needle. Well, now we're talking in 2020. ADA should not, hopefully, is not aspire to be compliant. It's more of, okay, ADA is where we were, so what are we doing to move past ADA? And so certainly we look at the ADA now as the floor. It's the bare minimum just to be able to be compliant. But now it's conversations such as these, and even talking about, retaining and hiring people with disabilities during COVID-19. It's like, okay, how do we move past ADA? But you do have to be cognizant of what the floor is to be able to move past that.
Very good. So it sounds like there has been some progress since ADA in 1990. Unlike the civil rights to some other minority groups, and particularly our Black communities, what hasn't changed? What hasn't worked for ADA?
Well, you always hate to look at the negative part, but I think there's always room for growth, right? I mean, when you look at 30 years later, and if you talk with people with disabilities and they've actually been discriminated against, it's still there. I mean, that's part of human error, I think, when we look at just about any component of employment. There's the whole disclosure and accommodation piece, and we'll talk about accommodations a little bit later, but there's still a lot of fear, there's still a lot of stigma. So unfortunately, the passing of the ADA did not change people's attitudes, so to speak, but it changed systems. So it was really looking at how systematically can we change things and putting into practices that are important for non-discrimination, but it didn't include people's bias or unconscious bias. So that I think is probably is still very prevalent piece there.
A lot of the work that Darla and I do and have done for a long period of time, it is just that. It's the changing the bias. It's understanding the lens in which we look at people. But the unfortunate thing is that we still have not made a major dent in the employment of people with disabilities. The percentages have not really gone up. There's still a huge discrepancy between the unemployment of individuals who associate with individual with disability or an individual with disability and ably bodied individuals. So even though we have law, it still has not necessarily changed. Even we have systems in place, it still has not necessarily changed the opportunities. I would say there are some opportunities. The systems, I think, some of them, and that's a whole different topic for discussion, is about what the systems and what they are able to do and what they aren't able to do at this point. But I also think that there's the component of, being able to not only hire an individual and feeling good about we hire somebody, but the title of what we're talking about today is retaining that individual. And then the holy grail is providing opportunities for that individual to actually advance. Mm-hmm. So it's not a park and stay. I got them in my door. This is great. I feel good about it. And that person's going to have that job for the rest of their working career. But now it's like, how do we as employers say, now they're in the door, let them have the same chances, and how do we have that and facilitate those? So those conversations are still there. So I think ADA was important. There are some things that unfortunately 30 years later we're still fighting. And I still don't, when we're talking, we do trainings for companies, those light bulb moments are still shine as bright today as what we did the first time. So people going, oh yeah. People, they have value and they are qualified for the jobs, in spite of a condition that they might have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think,
Unfortunately, oh, go ahead, Darla.
I was just going to piggyback on that, Andy. I think you're so right with the whole promotional thing, because there's too, sometimes we have some kind of perception maybe that people can only do so much. You know, someone with a disability can only do so much. And so I've even heard, right or wrong, I've heard employers will say, well, I'm not sure what positions we have for someone with a disability. And that should not be a consideration. It should be whatever a person's qualified for. That shouldn't limit what you promote or what you do outreach and recruitment for. When we want to target and include people with disabilities in your diversity and inclusion strategies, that should include all of your positions. Doesn't mean that you know, you're going to hire someone who's not qualified for a particular position, but you don't want to limit the positions or limit your thinking about what somebody can and can't do. Let them be the person that tells you what they can and can't do.
I think the other part about this is that when we talk about hiring and retaining people with disabilities, 1 in 4 Americans right now, based upon the census, is an individual with a disability. There's a high probability that number is actually going to slide to 1 out of 3 as more and more conditions are added to the, you know, and understood. So the idea that I want to go hire somebody with a disability tomorrow after the session, the reality is high probability you already have people employed. That 25% ratio, if you lay that over your population of people you employ now, it's a guarantee that you have hired people with disabilities, whether or not they disclose or not. So, you know, to Darla's point is, it's not a matter of what type of jobs can those people do. I hear that all the time.
Mm-hmm.
The reality is, what jobs do you have and what jobs are you looking for qualified people to do?
Mm-hmm.
And that's where you start changing that lens a little bit, and especially when you sit back and you're like, wait a second, if I have 100 people in my company, that means 25 of them most likely are individuals with disability who may not have disclosed or may not need an accommodation or whatever. So I'm already hiring people. You know, the other stat that we talk about is only 17% of individuals are born with their disability.
Mm-hmm.
That's 83% are going to acquire it sometime later in life. So even though the person you hire today may not necessarily have a disabling condition, you know,
Yeah.
it doesn't mean they're not going to acquire it later on while they're still employed with you. So the understanding of people with disabilities is, it's not a group you just go dip your toe into. The individuals around you are already employed by you. Now it's, you know, how do I retain them? How do I continue to move them on?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, unfortunately, it sounds like it's a compliance tool. But let's switch a little bit. And the title of this workshop is Taking Action During COVID Crisis. Has there been a positive impact during COVID on hiring people with disabilities?
Yeah, I think, I mean, one of the biggest parts about it is that the question always was, well, can the person come and they work in my facility? Can they work in our, you know, in our environment and that sort of stuff? Well, we were all kicked out of those environments, and we were all forced to be able to leverage technology. And the amendment that you and Darla both referenced in 2008, that technology and the driving for that actually was an enabler for us to probably be able to do the work that we were able to do over the past 2 months, right? It's, you know, everything from, you know, Microsoft and other products and other companies out there saying, well, in order to be compliant, we have to have technology that's available. Well, now we've also said, we don't even have to do this work here. And we're talking to companies all over, and a lot of them are talking about, well, you know, we have this huge office space. Well, we don't need this office space. We're just as productive, or, you know, more productive out of the office. And so that opens up an entire group of individuals who may not necessarily be able to go to an office. They can still do the work. And so I think there's the whole individual with disability goes back into what they can't do, to now the conversation is, what can they do? What's available? What do we need to have happen, versus the idea of, unfortunately, there's a perception that if you weren't in the office, you weren't working. I think we've blown that up pretty well over the past 2 months. But that was really one of the pieces. And so now it's more of not a matter of disability, but what is the ability that person, are they qualified and can they do the job?
Yeah, it's so true, Andy. And it also opens up the candidate pool, that the person doesn't have to live in Kansas City or in your local community. They could live anywhere. If that work can be done remotely, that just really opens up for employers. It opens up the number of people that they can look at recruiting. So both sides of the equation there. So
I think it's also, for those, my fellow HR folks on the call, we've had to face a whole lot of different challenges based upon the fact that we might have somebody actually test positive. And then what does that do? And so we're actually sending people home. They're not able to come to work. And so I think in the way it's a condition. It's a short-term condition, but they can't work here. They can still do their job. So I think there's a lot of overlap with, the fact that somebody can't work here, and now we're trying to track who they might have had, acquaintances with or been around, and now they're having to go home. But I'm having those same type of conversations with people with other conditions. And so it's actually allowing us to, it sounds like we're able to, the conversations are more free flowing versus being awkward. Right now it's the dialogue is happening more often than what it was before.
Yeah, and I think another thing too to point out is not all work can be done from home. And so some of you on the call today may be in an industry that you have to have people present. And my advice is to not perceive that people with disabilities are any more fragile than anybody else when it comes to the whole COVID-19. And so let that person be the one that understands themselves what they need in terms of maybe accommodation or something different. But if the expectation is to return to that business once that business is fully up and operating again, then it should be for, across the board. So
Andy and Darla, what types of positions or jobs is you've spoken about people being able to do the work from home? Give the audience some examples of what that looks like.
Well, it could be anything that requires heavy amounts of technology, or even calling. I have a lot of call centers that we've been talking to, just having that phone, having the technology. And we talked about earlier is that there's so much technology out there. To honestly sit down and say what type of jobs can't be done, can be done. It's almost easier to say what jobs can't be done. And Darla just, alluded to it. Some of them are, you can't do nursing necessarily, hands-on nursing from home. But on the other hand, you're like, wait a second, we're doing telehealth now. And that's really coming in a new way. There are manufacturing facilities that have to have people there to do the manufacturing. For the most part, most of our employers that we've been talking to are what can be done. I mean, if you are able to look at a P&L and look at what's one of the biggest anchors on a P&L sheet, it's going to be your fixed cost, which is my facility. Well, I can actually figure out how to do do this work from a different way, maybe not have to be here all the time. And that's the other part is that now you're talking about some companies saying, let's do hoteling, come in for 2 days a week. And, if we have to have in-person meetings, but the rest of the time, stay home. So I think it's really is kind of an interesting question. I don't know that there's necessarily an answer, but I think it's a question that's being asked by most employers at this point in time is what can be done remotely. Because on the other hand, we all are aware there may be, we're not out of it yet, and there may be more circumstances where this may happen to where, you're looking at largest one-day spikes in tested cases. It's like, well, we may all be back home or whatever and being locked down. So I think it's very proactive conversation taking place to answer that question, Greg.
Darla, have we made the business case for this? even before COVID for individuals with disabilities to work from home?
You know, I'm not sure if we made the business case in terms of for people to work from home. I think that that conversation is ramping up now that we have seen a lot of companies, just like Andy mentioned, people before saying, oh no, you have to be in the office to do this work, and found out, unfortunately, very quickly under the circumstances that maybe it didn't have to be done at work. And now some businesses are saying, you know, we're not sure we're going to return to our office space, just as Andy mentioned. So I don't know that we did a very good job at doing the, you know, as far as the business case for people working from home prior to this, but it certainly has increased the conversation now.
I do think the business case conversation has strengthened. Just, you know, Darla and I, when we talk to businesses all the time, talk about the business case for hiring individuals with disabilities,
Right.
in terms of attendance, in terms of engagement. So there's a lot, the engagement within the company, not only the engagement of that person, loyalty and, increased loyalty. So I think there's that business case is still there. It doesn't really matter if they're working at home or on the site. That business case is still very important, and it still has as much feasibility and credibility as I believe it ever has. But then also finding out that individuals may even be more productive in an environment that may have the accommodations they need within their living space.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the hiring of individuals, or the business case for hiring individuals with disabilities or retaining individuals with disabilities, is still very, very much in play.
Mm-hmm.
Before we jump into some of the strategies that businesses can use, can you talk a little bit about what sets are individuals with disabilities apart that they can do well that maybe the average person could not?
That's a loaded question.
Yeah.
Because each individual is unique. So I don't necessarily know that, there are some individuals who, may not do well in a social setting, but you give them a task to do and they could outperform their peers. I don't know that it's necessarily, they don't necessarily have superpowers. They are individuals who may have different aptitudes, just like anybody else. I know of people who don't have, that I'm unaware of, have a disability, but are Excel wizards, and they can do things and make numbers literally dance on the screen. Individuals with disabilities could do the same. So I don't know that there's certain jobs or certain things that people do better. I just think that given an opportunity, keeping in mind that individuals with disabilities have limited opportunities, they are very committed in ensuring the fact that they are doing a good job. They are very proud of their work. They find that it's been found that they'll be very loyal to the company because they're actually given a chance. And on the other hand, they're also loyal to the person who actually hired them. So they take it's a personal thing,
Yeah.
right? So it's not necessarily, well, I can just go get another job tomorrow. They're going to do everything they can to secure that job, because unfortunately, as we've been talking about, the opportunities have been limited.
Yeah, I think the more we can look at people with disabilities just as you would anyone else, the better the outcome is going to be. So even as we're talking about people working from home, not everyone is enjoying working from home. Greg, not to call you out, but I think early on you said, gosh, it took me like 2 weeks to get used to it,
That's right.
I just love being around people. And, there's lots of people that it really makes it even more isolating if they're working, by themselves, whether that's at home or in a work setting. So again, it's just looking at people's characteristics, looking at the skills they bring to the table, just like anyone else. And to me, it boils down to, what does the job require? What is my skill set? And how do I match to that? And I'm not going to be good at everything, just like anybody else wouldn't be good at, so it's all about that match, that perfect fit.
It's understanding the essential functions
Yeah.
What are the essential functions of the job, and can you perform them with or
Right.
without a reasonable accommodation? To Darla's point, people with disabilities and without disabilities working from home, that's a whole different ballgame.
Yeah.
So, productivity in general has gone up, but to an individual, we've seen it, both with our company and other companies where we had contractors that were offshore back home. And unfortunately, the 2 weeks that it took you, Greg, to kind of get used to it, some people are still, and it's 2 months later. So there's a lot of challenges with that, whether you have a condition or not.
Right. So let's talk about some strategies and resources to support outreach and recruitment.
I think one of the biggest things is intentionality, right? It's not you can just, well, we just want to go hire people with disabilities and I'm going to feel good about doing so. It's about understanding what the business case is, understanding the fact that this is a qualified talent pool that may or may not necessarily have the same experiences as other people. So if you lay two resumes next to each other, an individual who may not have all those experiences and somebody else, you're like, well, that person's more qualified. They might have had more jobs, but are they actually more qualified, right? So I think that there's understanding the person's background, understanding their experiences. People are like, well, I'm not sure that individual may be able to figure things out quickly. Well, I would push back. Individuals with certain conditions are having to figure out things very quickly in their everyday life. So how they maneuver, Darla mentioned transportation earlier. Oh my gosh, I love Kansas City, but we've got a horrible transportation system. It's one of the things we need to work on. So Greg, put that on our next chat. But I think how do I maneuver? How do I get around? How do I, so I think there's looking at people for what their experiences are and not necessarily doing an apples to apples comparison, because it's not fair. So I think there's an intentionality to understand what individuals who may not have had those work experiences, but have they had different types of experiences? Have they had volunteer experiences? Have they been showing up on time? Have they been doing different, so those slices and lenses in which we've been looking at people, I think you have to be very intentional about hiring individuals with disabilities. It's also understanding it's not about hanging your shingle out and say, let's just go hire people. It's, are we ready? Have we prepared ourselves? Is it, we had 70-some% say yes, disability inclusion's in our mission statement or value statement. Great. Where's your accommodation policy? Is it in HR? Is it in a 3-ring binder on somebody's shelf, or do people know how to ask for an accommodation? Are my job descriptions, are they current, or are they legacy job descriptions where we still require accountants to lift 75 pounds because they had to lift the banker's boxes, right, full of paper? We don't have to do that anymore. So I think there's an intentionality of sitting down and saying, are we ready? Is our house in order? And then we put our shingle, because that's the only way you can actually ensure sustainability. Worst thing that can happen to anybody is good intentions lead to a disaster. And now I have an employer brand that's out there that's may take a hit. On the other hand, here I thought I was going to do something really good. I was going to feel good about myself, and suddenly turned into a disaster. And well, now is this really how this is going to work? So, or it doesn't turn out the way I had hoped it had. So I think there's an intentionality you really do need to have a strategy behind it versus let's just go to a talent pool and see what happens.
Darla, what are some of the best practices in interviewing candidates with disabilities?
Well, I think number one best practice is to interview a person with a disability just like you would anyone else. You have in your application process, you don't have different applications for someone with a disability and someone without a disability. So why would you interview them differently? So make sure your questions are the same as you would ask anyone else. If there is a request for an accommodation for the interview, make sure that you have that you understand what that accommodation is and that you've provided that if at all possible. If it's something you don't know about, reach out to, groups that do work with people with disabilities. Reach out to us, reach out to Andy, ask those questions prior to the interview. And if you feel like you're going to be uncomfortable, then have someone with you. Have another, have a hiring manager, another HR person with you, another recruiter with you, so that it's, two people maybe asking the questions and fielding the questions. The other thing too about best practice of interviews, if someone requests an accommodation of an interpreter, or maybe they request an accommodation to have a job coach in the interview with them, if there's a second person, just always know that you're talking with that candidate, that you communicate with the candidate, regardless of if they have an interpreter. You're not looking at the interpreter, you're not asking the interpreter specific questions, or the job coach, you're asking that candidate. So just don't let that confuse you or distract you.
I think the other part about that is many of us now have applicant tracking systems, and our applicant tracking systems are going to be a screener. We have screening questions in there. Then some of them are actually have an assessment for a certain job that's in there. It has been shown that those assessments can be a stumbling block for somebody who may not necessarily have had work experience. Some of those assessments can be vague. So in lieu of somebody passing that assessment, you can actually do a longer interview. And I agree with Darla, interview somebody the same way, but the question is, what are you actually trying to interview them for? What's the question? So a lot of us now have moved to this behavioral-based questioning, to where it's like, past performance can predict future behavior. Okay, well, if I haven't had a job and you're asking me behavior-based questions, is that really is that assessing my ability to do the job, or is it my ability to actually play the game and answer the way you want it to be answered? One of the companies I used to work for, we had a question of, if you find $20 on the floor, what would you do? Well, that's the behavior-based question. We asked 9 individuals who had cognitive disabilities, who they said, you know what, I'd pick it up and put it in my pocket. Probably a very correct answer, right? A very honest answer, but not one that's going to get you hired. And so we came back to was, hey, if you find $20, what we're going to do is we're going to show you and train you on where to take that. Is that something you're willing to do? And they said, yes. It's like, okay, you're trainable. That's what I'm getting down to, versus in our minds, you have like 3 or 4 different answers that will get you past that question.
Yeah.
Putting it in your pocket's not one of them. So I think it's really understanding, what am I trying to ask? I may not say it the exact same way, but to Darla's point, it's to be able to assess the same things per individual. I may have to word something different. So the behavior-based interviewing is great, but it's relying upon past performances of an individual. If I've had a volunteer experience and you're asking me about $20 on the floor, I still may say I'm going to put it in my pocket. Mm-hmm. So I think there's that intentionality of really going through the application process, go through the assessments. I've had employers who sat there and said, we have great assessments, but they're the very things that are actually preventing us from tapping into that talent pool, because people are not able to pass it. So what's a workaround? Well, have them come in, see the job, walk around the building, see the experience themselves. And that's a best practice anyway for interviews. A lot of companies aren't able to take the time to do so when they do a lot of interviewing, but do that realistic preview. Ask questions, but ask what you want to have answered, not ask a question that the high probability is what's going to trip you up, and so therefore you're out. So that's part of our process, is just really sit down and say, if I'm realizing that my behavior-based questions are not getting to what I'm asking, I need to unpack it and ask it a different way. And so that's what we've trained our recruiters here. We've trained a lot of recruiters in a lot of other companies. It's like, if you're sitting in front of somebody, don't be afraid to pivot. or ask a question or re-ask a question if they have a different, it's like, I just don't think you're answering it or you understand what I'm asking. Rephrase it, but still assess everybody the same in terms of what the intangibles you're going after.
Yeah. So when recruiting individuals with disabilities, when you recruit minorities, you have to think outside the box in recruiting. How about for recruiting individuals with disabilities? What are some of the best practices? Because I know it's not the same. Darla?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And, I think some of the strategies can be the same, but you're right. I have had, many employers say, well, where do I find the candidates? I think Andy mentioned earlier that 1 in 4 people have a disability. So we're attracting people with disabilities all the time. We may not know it. But to actively look at that, I think one thing not to do, maybe this is a shameless plug, but the businesses that are partners with our organization make a statement by partnering that they are an employer of choice for people with disabilities. Same with Andy. They go to his organization, his company, to be seen as an employer of choice for people with disabilities. And so that's one way you can begin to practice a way of best practice in outreach and recruiting is where's your brand? Where are you making sure that people with disabilities are looking? One of our online job boards is a great place, and people look there all the time, see what positions are being posted from our business partners. And so that's really a great way to look at, for people with disabilities, where are they going to be looking for work? The other is partnerships. Who are you partnering with? Are you making sure that that's known to people? And then actively partnering with some of those organizations that represent candidates looking for work, right? Candidates with disabilities. So those are some key areas that I think are really good strategies to begin with.
And I think the other part about it is if you have a college recruiting arm, oftentimes it's, hey, we're going to go to the career fair, and boy howdy, we're going to partner with the career services office. Mm-hmm. Great strategy. You get your brand out there, but to Darla's point, where is your brand and where is it not? Is your brand with the disabilities office on campus, where students may have disabilities and need accommodations? Are you actually talking to that group? Unfortunately, the assumption of, well, it's career services, they take care of everybody. Unfortunately, that's not the case. Mm-hmm. Individuals with disabilities who need support within the university setting are not necessarily being serviced by career services because they actually don't understand how to support them, right? So if you're on campus and you're hitting the career fair and you're hitting the career services, fantastic. But there's going to be an office, and oftentimes it's not in the same building as career services. There'll be an office for disability services for students. Make sure your brand's there and make sure that it's out there. So it's understanding where your brand is and where it's not. I also think the other part about recruiting for individuals with disabilities is be authentic. If you have individuals with disabilities within your company, allow them to be part of that recruiting discussion. How do we go out and attract? What's our value proposition to individuals with disabilities? Help them, or allow them to help you with your value proposition to individuals. But then also, even when you're talking recruiting materials.
Yeah. When
you look back, and many times companies will sit there and say, okay, well, let's take all of our recruiting collateral and actually lay it out and say, are we represented diversely? Well, we can sit there, male, female, ethnicity, we're good. What about disability? Because it's the forgotten diversity segment most of the time. So now what do I do? Well, Darla and I have had conversations about companies go out and they're like, man, that is such a staged shot. Go find people who actually have the disability within your organization and that can actually be part of that conversation, be part of that photo shoot, or even get their testimonies about it. So I think that's part of the recruiting process. But then also, are you able to highlight how your diverse population and individuals with disabilities, how they actually impact your business. You know, Facebook does a great job. I don't know if anybody from Facebook's on or not, but you know, Facebook actually has an entire group of individuals with various conditions go and try and log into every apparatus you can log into Facebook, from the watches to flip phones to cell phones to laptops to desktops. And so that's a business imperative for them to make sure that they're accessible no matter what type of technology you have, but also what type of condition you might have. And so really celebrate and understand that individuals' disabilities making a difference in the company and celebrate that outwardly. So I think that's another big piece.
I think too, another best practice strategy on this particular topic is that internal referral. Many companies have, you know, employee referral programs, and I think that is really crucial to include, you know, outreach and recruitment of people with disabilities in that employee referral, because they're going to know people. They're going to have, you know, friends and family members and so forth. And I also think that in order to do that, we have to make sure our managers and our employees at large have some kind of awareness training, so that they're aware of what it is that you're trying to do. It's not about charity. It's not about, you know, we got to hire one person with a disability. No, it's about we're recruiting people. We want to include this in our diversity and inclusion strategies. We want to be intentional, like Andy's saying, we want to be intentional about this. And here's one way for us to be intentional. And we need your help. We need your help to do the messaging. We need your help to help, you know, like you would anyone else, to mention our openings to everybody, including people with disabilities. So help us do that.
One of the things I when you mentioned that, Darla, is we were working on a project. I was working on a project in Tennessee, and there's a small town. There just wasn't a lot of ready pools of talent, especially individuals with disabilities in that area. And you had that one community had everything from Amazon to Volkswagen to Kroger Foods, large employers in this one community of about 10,000 people. And, you know, we were in there, we were, you know, helping them be intentional, and they hired an individual who was from the deaf community, and everything seemed to go really well. And then suddenly 2 weeks later, there's another person from the deaf community who actually came in. We had no way, there wasn't a deaf center or a hearing impairment center or anything like that that we could actually go to, or even in an organization, but they actually self-referred their own friends who had similar conditions. And the first person was referred because an individual who was not hearing impaired referred to going, hey, I think we could actually do this, and here's my friend. So that friend referred their friend. Ironic thing is, after 6 months in that small town, we were able to recruit 20 individuals from the deaf community to come in, and they all worked out great. They were moving into even to the trainer role. But it's understanding that there's a community impact. And to Darla's point, your internal employees will be your biggest champions once they understand the what and the why. The how, they'll start doing the referrals. We've had, every time we do a training, and Darla and I were even in a training together we did, and people were coming up going, you know, I'm an individual with a disability, and the company doesn't even know it. But you know, I can perform my job. I don't need an accommodation, but I got a friend who has a similar condition, and I'm going to go refer. I mean, those conversations happen every time we do a training. So to Darla's point, making sure your internal communication is, again, intentional. Why are we doing it? And what is going on allows you to turn your own employee base into your own ambassadors.
Yeah.
Very good. So a company does it all right. They get the recruiting right. They're recruiting from places that they normally don't, and they're practicing good practices on interviewing. So now comes the onboarding process. What does a company do to? I think that's where really the retention of an individual starts, is at that part. Talk about the onboarding process and the best practices there.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because Darla and I actually just had this conversation last week. With some companies that, yeah, that mentor component is a huge. I mean, that's mentoring is big for able-bodied individuals or individuals with disabilities to be able to have that mentor, somebody they can rely upon. It's not a supervisor, right? So it's got to be somebody. Oftentimes it's maybe it's even somebody in a different department. Somebody can help navigate what day one looks like. Where are the bathrooms? What time do I go to lunch? What time are you supposed to leave? I mean, how do I punch in? How do I keep track of my time? But it's also 2 weeks down the road. It's also 2 months down the road, because really it takes about a year for somebody to really feel comfortable within their job and not necessarily think, I don't know, so I'm not going to ask. Giving them an opportunity to ask somebody in a fairly non-threatening environment and relationship certainly is a big piece of it. So I think that mentor component, because we all have the same, the technology can be leveraged for forms. It's not the forms that actually get people to retain them. It's actually the relationships that they have and they build. Even that mentor will introduce that person to people outside their department. So the more relationships I can have, the more I'm feeling engaged by the company and I feel a part of that company.
Absolutely. I think, Andy, it is interesting how we had this conversation last week with folks. The mentorship piece is huge. And if you don't have a formal mentor program in your company, that's okay. Look for those people who kind of bubble up as the ones that like to help people feel welcome. In my many years of working in all kinds of different businesses, I've always found at least one person who loves doing that. They love showing people around. They love introducing them to other people. So if you don't have a formal mentor programs established, look for those folks. I think that's a good best practice there.
I think the other interesting part about that, though, is oftentimes mentors are viewed as people who've been with the company for a very long time, right? They know the ins and outs. They know what's going on. The ironic thing is, we have found, this is just observation, is that's a population of individuals who may have more of a bias. But the newer workforce that's coming in, they have a great sense of community. They have a great sense, their individuals with disabilities have been integrated and mainstreamed, and they don't even necessarily see disabilities as much, in terms of a barrier. It's more like, okay, it's just who that person is. And so I think that engaging even newer employees in that mentor program, to Darla's point, allow people to self-select in, because you'll find those people are bubbling up to the top and they want to do good while at work. And that is an engagement driver. Other than I make widgets today, it's like, you know what, I got to show up today because Andy's coming in and I know he needs me to help him get through, some things. I'm more engaged in my workforce than I would have been otherwise. So the mentor program is a big piece.
Good.
Yeah, and I think too, making sure, Andy, you mentioned earlier about the internal process and making sure kind of our in-house is in order. I think one of the things that's really crucial is looking at what does the orientation and training piece have included in there about inclusion in general. Some companies will have statements like treat everyone with respect, or treat everyone like you'd want to be treated, those kinds of things. And what are the policies? Are people aware of the accommodation policies? Are people aware of, any kind of policy related to asking for accommodation? The other thing too is, I know we've had many years of research when it comes to the field of disability and employment of people with disabilities. And one of the things that people always talked about was the fact that most people don't lose their job because of the task of not being able to perform the task. It's more that social piece. And if you think about a job that you've had in the past that you didn't, maybe you didn't like it, or maybe it was something that just wasn't a good fit. Think about the things that weren't the good fit. I've changed jobs, before because maybe I didn't get along with my immediate director or supervisor, or my immediate boss. Maybe I just wasn't feeling like I was connecting with colleagues or coworkers. People move on more so about that social piece. So I think that it makes it even more crucial that we look at how are people feeling included and welcomed, and what do we have in place in terms of our policies and practices that help enhance that.
I think that you brought up an interesting point about the training, Darla. That's part of the onboarding, right? It's you got to learn your job. Well, understanding that can be an accommodation in of itself, right? So the training, I may actually pair a trainer with somebody for a longer period of time. I may actually say, usually it may take an individual 3 weeks to learn the job. Well, if the person continues to progress, maybe look at elongating that training period to where it's like, okay, the threshold is as long as you're continuing to move forward and continue to get better, maybe it's a 6 weeks instead of a 3 week period. So a lot of companies have kind of done that. It's like, hey, you know what? You can do the job. Let's not artificially say you have to be able to do it within 2 weeks or you're out. So I think that's part of that. Continue to review your processes, understanding your procedures, understanding your training thresholds and that sort of stuff. So I think it really is being able to look at everything from, the time the person puts in an application to the time they do the onboarding materials to the time they start doing their job. What does that life cycle look like? And take a long, hard look when we're talking about being intentional. It's look at the entire lifespan of an employee and where are those intersections that you might be able to accommodate.
Yeah.
Let's pause for a minute and answer a couple of questions that we've had from the audience. First, Darla, I'd like you to speak to this. The question is, any local teams in KC that we can recognize as leading inclusive hiring best practices, since we've already talked a little bit about that, and or reach out to a company seeks to improve its best practices. And then, Andy, I have a question for you as well.
So if I understand right, the question is more so about who's kind of doing this best practice.
Correct.
Is that correct? Okay.
This is from a attendee who wants to know.
Yeah, I think that, there's some good questions there. I think a lot of the companies that we work with are doing some really good stuff. I would say kudos to Andy's company. With what he's doing in Allied Global, they're doing some fantastic stuff there as well. But I would say one of the companies I've worked with real closely is one of our platinum partners, LMV Automotive. They're doing some really great stuff with how they're bringing people on board. I would probably say just pretty much any of the companies that we're working with are doing some really great stuff. So, if you're wanting some names specifically, whoever asked that, if you'd like to email me afterwards, I'd feel more comfortable talking to you, about that individually.
Absolutely. And Andy, the question, it's a long question, but I'm just going to read part of it because it's a couple of questions. But some employers have helped connect people with disabilities who have hired, feel more connected through employee groups called employee resource or affinity groups. Other employers are hesitant about such groups, particularly for people with mental health related disabilities. Can you please offer suggestions? So they're basically asking about ERGs.
Yeah, so great question. I would say that what we have found is when you set up an ERG or a BRG, right, employee resource group or business resource group, and there's a difference. ERG is more of a, we have a common affinity, we get together, we do some great things, but there's not necessarily a business driver behind it. Where BRG, you have a charter, oftentimes you have allocated resources, executive sponsors, and it's there for a business purpose. So the ERG, BRG, when you start an ERG with an individual around disabilities, what you actually find is not necessarily the individual's disabilities joining first. What you usually find are caregivers, brothers, sisters, moms, dads, whatever, of individuals who may have a disabling condition who oftentimes join first. So self-disclosure is still there's still a big stigma, as Darla mentioned earlier, to disclosure. So there can be a frustration of like, well, I'm not seeing people with disabilities. One, a lot of people have hidden disabilities, so you can't really sit there and say you don't have a disability. But what we're finding is that group can be speculative in nature, so they're a little pessimistic. It's like, well, what do you want to know that for? Because companies necessarily have not handled that information well. So if you do start, which I highly recommend, is starting a resource group, whether it be a BRG or an ERG, for individuals centered around disability. And so you'll have able-bodied individuals come along, but it will take a little bit of time for people to understand the purpose. That's why I would actually say it's a BRG. That way it's business-driven. It has outcomes. It has certain. It has a charter, so people understand, like, oh, here's what the confines are of the BRG. So that would be my thing: is start with a BRG, not necessarily an ERG, and be patient. It will happen. You just may not necessarily see or really know that people with disabilities are coming part of the group.
Very good.
Yeah, that's a good point. I also think too, if I could piggyback on this, that we may see more people wanting and needing these types of groups now that we're seeing an uptick in anxiety and fear around all of the COVID-19 experiences that people are having. We do see an increased level in anxiety and depression, and so the whole mental health awareness piece is really something that's crucial right now, and health and wellness programs. So I think that we may see even a more need for promotion, awareness around the ERG, BRG strategies.
Thank you for covering that, Darla. That was the second part of the question we had. But we got a couple more questions that we're going to hold off for a minute because we want to get through a couple of the topics, and then we'll have some time to answer these specific questions from our audience. But for now, I wanted to just talk a little bit about accommodations. What are accommodations? And how do you do that? What's the best way to accommodate an employee who needs them?
So this is in and of itself can be a long conversation, but we'll try and boil it down. So one of the things that, accommodation, oftentimes in a company, it's like, well, suddenly we're getting HR involved, suddenly we're getting legal involved. The reality is we're accommodating people all the time. If you take the word accommodation, actually flip it on its ear and say it's a job aid, something that somebody needs to do their job, now it's a different lens, right? So now I don't have this big fear about it. It's like, oh, you need a screen reader in order to do your job. That's a job aid, right? So, I wear my glasses and that sort of stuff, but if I got to the point to where I need a screen reader, that's fine. Darla doesn't necessarily need one to do her job, and that's okay, right? So the accommodations don't necessarily have to be, people think, well, if I accommodate one person, I have to accommodate the other. No, I mean, you do have to talk about the accommodations, and it's called an interactive process. So it's, what's the job aid? What do you need to do? What do you need? What tool or what modification do you necessarily need to do your job to maintain the essential functions of your job? That's really where it boils down to, is can you still do the essential functions, or what is being impacted for you not being able to perform your job? And now let's talk about a job aid, not necessarily an accommodation. So I think that's part of that conversation. It could be anything from changing the lights out. And, I'm sitting in an office right now where we have fluorescent lights. A lot of people can't deal with fluorescent lights. Well, okay, fine. I'll switch out the light bulbs to something else, right? So there's different ways of accommodating, and accommodation is broad spectrum. There's a lot of different things, but basically it's a job aid to help an individual perform the essential functions of their job productively.
Yeah, and I like to think of it too as kind of three components. of strategy when it comes to accommodations. Now, if somebody asks for something very specific, of course, that's a little different. But if you think about it as adjusting what may already be in place, so I might just have to adjust my workspace, or second, I might have to adapt something. So I'm going to change the way something's being done in order for a person to be able to do that particular task. For example, I might, if I am requiring someone to lift 50 pounds, I might be able to allow a colleague to work with them in that lifting of that 50 pounds. So you can do it in partnership or in teams. And then thirdly, supplementing. What do I have to bring into the work site that may not have already been there that can help with that accommodation? So adjust, adapt, supplement are all areas that you can look at when having to accommodate, or as Andy puts the
does that go the same for hidden disabilities like autism or mental illness?
So so part of it is we had an individual who had to go start up a machine every day, and he was fantastic. He had a lot of great references, a lot of great background, but for some reason he just couldn't start the machine. It wasn't the fact that he wasn't told, he wasn't shown, and that sort of stuff. He had to start up the machine every time he came, for the start of the day, at the end of break, at the end of lunch, at the end of break. I mean, so it was like he just couldn't do it. And the conversation was, if you can't start the machine, what do we do? But he was a fantastic mechanic. He was able to, somewhere along the line, he just couldn't put those pieces together. So a manager went home, I think it was on his second day, went home and took 3x5 cards and just wrote down step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. Hung it on a little ring. It was pretty inexpensive, little snap ring, hung it up on his machine. And he went back that morning and went through step 1, step 2, step 3, started the machine. He was fine. That was an accommodation or a job aid to help him get through. But after that, he was fantastic. He could tweak it. He could run that machine. But for some reason, there was just something so that he didn't say, honestly, we didn't know what the condition was. We just knew there was just something that he couldn't get through. And so ironically, that one accommodation suddenly started to be accommodations for everybody. So it's actually an accommodation. The job aid helped everybody else do their job, because now they started putting up the startup processes for each machine on their machines themselves or near the machine. So, it doesn't necessarily mean what your condition is. It's just, what do you need help with? What is that aid? What's that job aid? What's that, do I need to supplement something? Because there certainly wasn't any directions there for 40 years in that company on how to start up that machine, until that person hung a 3x5 cards on a ring on the thing. So I think that's part of the understanding that accommodations, not necessarily, it's what does that specific person need to do their job. Accommodation may not necessarily be, Darla may need a different accommodation than I might to do a certain task. So it really is down to what do they really need to have happen.
So speaking of accommodations, what is considered a reasonable accommodation versus an employer hardship? What's the difference?
One's easier to get done than the other.
The easy answer.
I mean, honestly, a reasonable accommodation is, what's a job aid that needs to be, in the conversation, the interactive process, what's termed as reasonable, right? I mean, most accommodations don't cost anything, and over 50% of those accommodations that do cost anything are less than $500. So, when you sit back and you're looking at a employer hardship, first of all, attendance is not an accommodation. You have to be, the courts have come out and said you have to be at work, right? So you have to be able to be at work, and it's not an accommodation. I have to be off for 2 weeks. for my condition. That's not an accommodation the companies are forced to make. On the other hand, such as, do I need to put in an elevator? That's a big to do. That's a big piece. That could be a significant hardship for an employer. We've had employers sit back and say, do I need to have doors that are opening that I can actually just hit the button, handicap accessible mechanical doors that would open up one way or the other so the person can get in. Some employers have said that's a hardship. Well, you have to really understand you're going to go to court, and first of all, your legal team is going to have to sit there and defend the fact that a $200 or $300 modification to your building, or maybe $1,000, depending on what type of modifications you, is going to be a financial burden to your company. Most legal teams are like, we're not taking that to court, especially depending on the size of your company. Now, there are smaller companies where it's like, I can't afford to do that renovation. If I have 10 people in my building, I can't afford to put those in. That definition of an employer hardship may be different than a Fortune 500 company, right? So it really is having that process and understanding, is it a financial impact, or is it an inconvenience, or is it just something you don't want to do? And I think those are all things you kind of sit back and you have to have a hard look about what those accommodations are. I've seen employers go to great lengths to accommodate. So to say that there isn't a precedent for going to great lengths, that's not true. There are a lot of employers out there who have gone to great lengths to do some accommodations.
I totally agree with that, Andy. I think for the most part, I see companies and employers accommodating all the time and are very willing to. We know the average cost of accommodation is not, well, sometimes it doesn't cost anything, right? It's at adjusting or adapting. But it's also, I think $500 is about the max that on average that accommodation would cost. I've seen an employer, one in particular, that had their call center on the second floor, and the only way up was stairs or a freight elevator. And I had someone that, used a wheelchair, and it didn't occur to them that when, in the beginning, that person might not be able to get out of the building in an emergency if that freight elevator wasn't working. And so to accommodate, and this was this employer's way of saying, hey, we want to employ more people that might need this accommodation, they moved that entire call center down to the first floor. Now, not every company has that additional space or that ability to do something like that, but I think that shows the commitment that companies have to look at how can we make this inclusive for all people, and how can we make this a non-issue for hiring additional people who may have mobility issues. So I agree with Andy that I see people making those accommodations all the time.
Before we move on to our, I'm sorry, go ahead, Andy.
I was just going to say that when you take that accommodation piece out and you look at it as a job aid, yeah. What's an aid for somebody in that role to do their job? And to Darla's point, oftentimes what's good for one is good for many. And so that's processes can be changed. So, my earlier example of, now we're posting signs. It's just understanding it's not just for one person. There are some things, if you need a mechanical chair or a scooter to get from one end of a building to another, obviously that's for an individual, but most accommodations are mutually beneficial to more individuals than just one.
Yeah.
Before we get to one of our final topics, there's a question, and it's really simple, but what about hiring by small employers? Do all the strategies you mentioned apply to them as well? Is there specific things small employers have to do differently?
When we work with smaller employers, the ironic thing is that the idea of being intentional still stands. Understanding what your processes are still stands. The onboarding process still stands. The thing though, I actually like working with small employers because of the fact that oftentimes we find that there's not so much red tape that needs to be managed in order for change to happen. So they can move, they can adjust their own processes and procedures more often. But I do still think it's your employer brand that's out there, and there's still that intentionality needs to be there. But smaller employers I've found are, I'm not saying it's easier, but have less barriers to be able to make that pivot to be a disability-friendly employer.
Yeah, and I definitely think too that word of mouth gets around. They may not have the budget for all of the major advertising, but that word of mouth gets around quickly. And when they start hiring people with disabilities and make that intentional, like Andy mentioned, that goes a long way. And it goes a long ways too for their customers. People tend to, frequent a store or be a customer of a restaurant or any kind of business more often if they know that they're employing people with disabilities.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I think that's the other part. Is training individuals within your business on how to interact with individuals. What do I say? What don't I say? What if I say the wrong thing? With individuals with just different conditions or different abilities, or it's not just a job skill, right? This is a life skill. So companies that we work with, and Dara's spot on, it also impacts your customer base. If I'm actually understanding how to work with my hearing impaired employees, if I'm a guest facing company, suddenly now I'm able to understand how to interact with my hearing impaired customers. And now my customers are going to start coming. So it really is, it's not necessarily a job skill. And we say this all the time. It's a life skill. It's understanding that. And I think, unfortunately, people haven't been intentional about understanding. So our biases allow us to put up our blinders or our fear factor. By going in and intentionally, if a company doesn't do anything else other than just train on disability inclusion, you actually find that the inclusion will actually start to take place.
Mm-hmm.
So a company that has done everything right, they've recruited, they hired, they onboarded, created ways to retain employees. What about evaluation? How do you evaluate an employee with a disability?
That is the same. Remember we talk about,
Same as you would anyone else.
Same job, same pay. The last part about that is same expectations.
Yeah.
If you decide to, if consciously or unconsciously lower the expectations of an individual with disabilities who's getting paid the same, doing the same job as somebody else, and they're not performing, that's a recipe for whatever you thought goodwill was going to come of it will actually start to spin up animosity within your team, right? So if I'm making X number of dollars, if I'm making $16 an hour and I'm only hitting 50%, and Darla's doing the same job I am, and she's making $16 an hour, how long is it going to take for Darla either to start dropping her productivity because I can still get paid the same rate for lower expectations? That's an issue. So it's same job, same rate, same job, same pay, same expectations along the way. We had a situation where an individual was working in a warehouse and, for 6 weeks wasn't able to make the rate. And we're like, at this point in time, we've elongated the training, we've done accommodations. He just still couldn't get there. Now everybody loved this guy. Everybody, they referred to him as the mayor. He'd shake hands, talk to everybody in the morning. Everybody enjoyed having him around. The problem was he wasn't making rate, and it was starting to cause some animosity. So the people in his pod heard about this, and they're like, time's got to be running out. So we got a phone call one day saying, hey, he's suddenly making rate. And we're like, that's fantastic. What was the secret sauce, or what was his pixie dust that we spread on, to make him, allow him to do that? And they're like, we don't know. So we were like, well, let's just come in and observe. What we observed was the people in his pod were actually taking and throwing a box on the line when they would go to break or they would go to the bathroom or whatever. And so they were basically artificially inflating his rate, his piece rate. At the end of the day, we had to let him go because other people were seeing that and there was animosity starting to spin up. And so as much as we liked him, understanding that's, you know, we had to make that hard decision, but it was based upon the same expectations as everybody else. So.
Yeah, I totally agree. And Andy, I'd like to add to that, that with that expectation that some people may ask for a job coach to be with them the first few weeks or days, weeks, whatever of their employment, and know that first, that job coach is an accommodation, right? Second, when you're doing performance evaluations or any kind of measuring of performance, make sure that job coach isn't doing part of the work, you know, like you were saying, Andy, with the people helping out. And then make sure that the employee is the one that you're doing the evaluation on. If that job coach is having an issue, that's a separate thing that you have to take care of. So deal with whoever that agency is where the job coach is coming from. But I totally agree with it. We've got to make sure that those expectations are held the same. Same thing with disciplinary action. I don't know I know we could get into that, you know, lengthy discussion there, but just making sure that you're treating people the same in that way too, that you've followed your proper standard operating procedures like you would with anyone else. And if it comes down to it, yes, you can fire somebody. It doesn't matter if they have a disability or not.
So let's, these have all been fantastic strategies and great advice. Let's look at the last poll question and see what our panelists are planning to do. Sydney? So the question is, do you see yourself implementing any of these strategies presented in today's webinar? Let's see what the results are. I hope it's 100%. Yes.
Well, at least there's no no's yet.
No pressure. I was just gonna say.
We're good.
Very good.
More seconds.
Very good.
Very good. All right. Thank you, Sydney.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's great. I would just encourage people to, if you have questions, you can always reach out to any of us here. I think I added my info to the chat, so you can find it there. And, you know, Andy and I have done training in the past. We've done consultation in the past, or we've enjoyed working together. And I think you know, reach out to us, ask us questions. So we'd love to talk to you about partnership if you're not currently partnering with us, and we'd love to help you guys with any kind of celebrations, since there was a lot of people that said they didn't know or they weren't planning on doing any celebrations for the ADA. July 26th is the actual date. It falls on a Sunday, but you can do things throughout the whole month, starting now till whenever. It just brings more awareness to those diversity and inclusion strategies that you have.
As we mentioned earlier, the poll that we took the first time, right, it was, you know, who's going to do something about ADA, and then, you know, do you have ADA or do you have disability in your inclusion statement? Ask questions. If that's where your starting point is, and say, I don't know what we do or don't know, ask. And one thing can make a huge difference. You may even have a cascading effect. Right? If you start the conversation internally, what are we doing? How do we accommodate? Or what do our strategies look like? Or do we even have an accommodation policy? And do people know how to get to it? So I think it's anything, just start doing something is a step in the right direction, right? The worst thing we can do is automatic failure is doing nothing. So if you do one thing, you can actually start moving that process along. And you'll also find that disabilities is not such a taboo conversation anymore. And that's why I'm thrilled to have been able to be a part of the conversation today with Darla and Greg. This is not about what it was 30 years ago. Now it's like, let's leverage individuals who are able-bodied or able to do things to be able to talk about their contributions and not what they can't do. And so I think that's really where we start having those conversations internally, is we need good talent. Yeah. There's talent pools that we haven't tapped into as employers. And I've been in recruiting for 25 years. There's only in the last 10 that I've realized there's a rich group of individuals out there who just need a chance. As long as you screen them same job, same pay, same expectations, you can really tap into a great pool of talent.
Very good. Well, thank you. That's going to conclude our webinar. But before we let you go, I want to let you know that there is a second part to this webinar, and that is on our last event of the year. It's called Demystifying the Hiring and Retaining of People with Disabilities. And that will take place on November 24th, right before the Thanksgiving holiday. We will definitely send you some more information on that with plenty of notice to join us again for another great conversation with Darla and Andy. With that, on behalf of the Greater Kansas City Chamber of Commerce and our partners who make this possible so that we can offer these workshops without any cost to you, that's Community America, Evergy, Hallmark, and Sprint. Thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to see you at our next 3 events. With that, have a wonderful day and take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Darla. Thanks, Andy.
Thanks, Greg.
Thank you.